But she can tell us about the amnion, and because she gives us a way to check whatever Nick says, which probably won't be the truth unless he knows we'll catch a lie. And we need Davies, so we can learn what the amnion hope to get out of him. This is our chance. We can put Director Donner aboard Trumpet. Once she gets close enough to transmit a message, she can invoke Joshua's new codes. Then he'll take her orders. With her in command and Punisher as escort, she can take them all to some place Sun won't find them, and nobody else will get in our way. We can learn everything they know at our own pace, and we won't have to let events rush us. And there's another benefit, he hurried to add before Holt ran out of patience. Special Counsel Maxim Eigenzard wants blood. If we don't contain him... Deliberately, Warden spoke of we, as if there were no distinction between himself and his master. He won't stop until he finds something that makes us look dirty. So dirty he can dictate his own terms to the GCES. But if we produce survivors from Billinggate, these specific survivors, most of his case against us will collapse. We'll be able to prove that what we've gained justifies the risks we took. We'll even be able to give him an explanation he can't refute for what we did with Intertech's mutagen immunity research. And not abandoning Morn Highland will do wonders for our credibility. Faced with the dragon's seething concentration, Warden asked tightly, "Are you listening to me, Holt? When you look like that, I feel like I'm talking to a wall. This is an opportunity we can't afford to miss." Abruptly, Holt snorted. As if he were emerging from a trance, he shook his arms and shoulders, rubbed his hands over his cheeks. His eyes blinked rapidly to clear his vision. "You probably believe that, you blind idiot," he growled. "Warden Dios, the fucking idealist." His anger was so vivid that it left afterimages on Warden's IR site. "You almost make me regret choosing you for this job. After all these years, you still don't know what you're for, what the whole goddamn UMCP is for. You still think I invented you because I wanted cops. If this weren't a terrible time to change directors, I would throw you out on your ass and find somebody with better brains. Will you listen to me, Ward? This is your last chance. Do you really think I've missed the point?" A pang twisted Warden's heart, but he tightened his arms so that the pain didn't show. "When you start yelling," he retorted trenchantly, "I don't know what to think." "In that case," Holt said like a breath of flame, "I'll keep my voice down. I don't want to give you any excuse for making a mistake. These are orders, and you..." With the knuckles of one hand, he rapped every word onto his desktop, "are going to carry them out. You want this Davies Highland? So do I. I want him delivered here, to me, in person." Warden tried not to let himself hope. He couldn't afford it in front of the dragon. Holt was taking the bait. "Why? If you can't figure that out," Holt rasped, "you don't deserve an answer. But it does mean Trumpet has to be kept alive. I don't like anything else you've done here, and you as sure as shit haven't convinced me I can trust you, but I'll give you that one. Trumpet has to be kept alive. Since I don't trust you, I'll tell you how to do it. I'm not going to put up with arguments or insubordination or delays. If you give me any grief, I'll jerk you out of UMCP HQ so fast your vital organs will be left behind. Warden braced himself behind his arms and waited for the axe to fall. Rapping the desktop again, Holt said, I want you to contact Trumpet. Make Director Donner do it. He sneered harshly. You're so busy protecting her, I want her to get her hands dirty. I want you to make her get her hands dirty. Go on. Say it. Warden clasped his chest until he could hardly breathe. Say it and get it over with. Holt's aura shone with cruelty and relish. Tell her to give Joshua's new priority codes to Nick Siccorso. In spite of his grip on himself, Warden flinched. For an instant, time seemed to stop. Behind his rigid expression and his flat stare, he went into shock. Tell her to give Joshua's new priority codes to Nick Siccorso. A magnesium flare took fire in his guts. This was worse than anything he'd feared, anything he could answer. Holt had beaten him. In his most costly nightmares, he hadn't dreamed that his master would go so far. To Nick Siccorso. We'll let Siccorso take Taverner's place, the dragon explained as if he were licking his chops. That way, we can make sure Joshua doesn't spring any more surprises on us. Siccorso can force him to follow my orders when I'm ready. Joshua's new priority codes. Whom had he betrayed most? Angus or Morn? They were the offspring of his most secret desires. He'd stripped them of everything they needed or owned in the name of passions they hadn't asked for and couldn't share. And those passions had just died as if Holt had driven a stake through Warden's heart. Once Siccorso takes command of Joshua and Trumpet and gives us confirmation so I know I'm safe, we'll give him the rest of my orders. Tell her. Oh, Min, you are going to hate me for this. Without Morn's testimony, the bill of severance would never pass. Not now, and certainly not later, when the UMCP would be more vulnerable. But Warden couldn't collapse now, couldn't bear to let Holt unman him entirely. He still had work to do. Damage control. His last duty when everything had gone wrong, and the dragon's rapacity swallowed human space. Shame, if nothing else, required him to stand up, face the consequences of his arrogance and folly, save what last small things might still be preserved. He refused to fail under the burden until he'd paid for everything. From somewhere, as if he were digging it out of a grave, he found the strength to ask, "Which are?" Holt grinned. His aura reeked of pleasure. Kill everybody aboard except Davies Highland. Have him bring Davies to me. Let him keep one or two of his people if he needs them. Make him kill the rest, especially Morn Highland and Vector Shahid. You and those two bastards have done enough harm. Through a storm of chagrin, Warden realized that Holt had recognized Shahid's name after all. In a bleak tone, like one of the damned, he murmured, "How am I supposed to make him do all that? He doesn't have any priority codes." Holt positively gleamed with ferocity. "By offering him something he wants. We'll let him keep Trumpet and Joshua. He'll jump at it. He can't refuse a ship like that, or the chance to have a welded cyborg for crew. Angus. Oh, Angus, it was all for nothing. I did it to you for nothing. I told you it's got to stop. But instead of stopping anything, I committed a crime against you that you'll have to live with until Nick does you enough harm to kill you. And mourn as well. Nick might agree to kill her, but until the end, she would be his to torment and degrade as much as he wished. Past his arms and his lacerated heart, Warden sighed. I'm sure you're right. Nick Scorzo is exactly the kind of man who will jump at an offer like that. Holt leaned forward, pouncing. Sharp with relish, he hissed, You son of a bitch, you're mine. Mine. I invented the cops. I invented you. You're as welded as any cyborg, and you've had your last chance at getting me in trouble. From now on, you're going to do what I tell you, when I tell you, how I tell you. And you're going to thank your pitiful ass you aren't dead. Do you really think I've missed the point? Warden shook his head. Slowly he unclamped his arms. Every muscle in his chest and legs ached with cramps. He felt as stiff and unsteady as a cripple. Nevertheless, he climbed to his feet. Holt didn't need to dismiss him. He knew he was finished. Fighting knots and strain, he limped toward the door. Follow orders, Holt said after him. I'm watching, and you know I can do it. That's what all those listening posts are for. If you mess with me, I'll find out. Then you're dead. Warden nodded, as if he were. When Holt unsealed the door, however, Warden didn't open it. Instead, he turned back to the dragon. Holt had surprised him with an act of imaginative malice he hadn't expected and couldn't match. There were other things he could do, however. He understood power and manipulation. He could still fight. With his hand on the door and no hope left, he replied to his doom with an imaginative act of his own. Speaking of your mother, he said distantly, I haven't seen her for a long time. Do you mind if I visit her before I go? It should only take a few minutes, and I can spare the time. We have hours before our best window on the next listening post Punisher is likely to pass. My mother? Holt was surprised. His face showed it as plainly as his emissions. Norna? What in hell do you want to visit her for? The UMCP director shrugged awkwardly, falsely. She's become something of a legend over the years. Like an oracle, you might say. I want to ask her what makes her think I've been trying to get you in trouble. Holt scrutinized Warden hard. The uncertainty of his aura suggested that he felt the threat in Warden's request, but couldn't identify it. After only a moment, however, his expression cleared, and he laughed acidly. You poor, misguided lump of shit. You're still trying to play games with me. Go ahead. He fluttered his hands. Visit her. Enjoy it, if you can. You two deserve each other. And there's a good chance you're going to end up just like her. As Warden opened the door and closed it behind him, Holt was speaking into an intercom, instructing HS to conduct the UMCP director to Norna Fasner and let him talk to her for 10 minutes before escorting him to his shuttle. Privately, Warden told the 2 guards who came to his sides. As soon as he left Holt's sight, his manner became authoritative and sure. He sounded as steady as a rock. I want to talk to her alone. Check with him if you don't trust me." "Yes, sir." As far as home security knew, Warden Dios was still the second most powerful man in human space. "This way." Walking briskly to work the cramps out of his legs, Warden followed the guards. Holt had said, "You are mine." But he was wrong. Warden may have lost everything else, but he was still himself. While any piece of him remained, he intended to go on fighting. Warden. He was at his best when he was ashamed. He could not have explained that. He was hardly aware of it. Yet it was true. The tension between his unyielding passion for standards of integrity, commitment, and efficacy, so untrammeled that they could never be attained, and his sense of mortal chagrin when he fell below those standards, was fruitful for him. It taught him strengths he might never have known he possessed. Shame and idealism were the means by which Holt Fasner had manipulated him into becoming what he was, the director of the UMCP, guilty as charged, the man most directly responsible for the corruption of the cops. Holt had focused his idealism, his essential belief that it was the honorable and necessary function of the police to serve and protect humanity, to position him where he would be vulnerable, then had exercised his shame to push him farther and farther from those ideals. In a sense, Warden had accepted this. Presumably, he could have refused at any time, could have preserved the man he wished to be by letting Holt fire him. At the worst, Holt might have had him killed. So what? Warden knew to his cost that there were many worse fates than death. Yet he hadn't refused. At every crisis, he'd resisted the dragon's cunning up to a certain point. Then he'd let it carry him along. In a sense, the reason he did this was simple. All his life, he'd considered himself inadequate to his dreams, unequal to the task of making them live. Certainly he'd been too flawed to see Holt Fasner accurately when the dragon had security. Stupid with naivete, he'd believed that he was being given a chance to do good, valuable work for a good, valuable man, and Holt had encouraged that illusion with every trick at his command. Hungry with dreams and shame, Warden had learned to define himself in terms of law enforcement at its noblest, service and protection for those who needed it most, and could afford it least. By the time he'd realized that Holt used the cops for no purposes but his own, and that those purposes had nothing to do with idealism, Warden had already acquired a taste for the nourishment his sore heart craved, the food of lawful power. So who could hope to stop the dragon, if not an officer of the law? Whose job was it? And to whom did that job properly belong, if not to the man who had helped make the dragon powerful by allowing his own hopes to blindly because he considered himself culpable? Warden Dios had sworn to take any risk and pay any price which might help him undo the harm he'd caused by supporting Holt Fasner's ambitions. Of course, he couldn't undo that harm if he weren't a cop. The authority of his position as all that enabled him to act. He couldn't afford to sacrifice that authority in the name of personal honor. Therefore, he swallowed the compromises and betrayals necessary to keep his job, earn the dragon's trust. When he wasn't engaged in some dirty business of Holt's, he developed and ran the UMCP as if his organization were indeed as incorruptible as it should be. And in the dark corners of his mind, through the gaps between his other commitments, he set about the complex, secret task of arranging Holt's downfall. Inevitably, the dragon caught glimpses of this. He knew better than to trust his UMCP director too much. So he strove to bind Warden closer to him with new acts of complicity and shame. But there he erred. He misunderstood the true nature of Warden's dreams. Warden, farther away, drove him to imagine more, dare more, suffer more, in the name of his real passion. Shame pushed him. He was no longer the man he'd once been. He'd transcended himself long ago. By will and mortification, he'd become more than he or Holt Fasner or anyone else realized. When Holt outplayed him, demanded that he sacrifice Morn and Angus as well as everything they represented, Warden was left stripped of his hopes, naked with chagrin at all the harm he'd done. And done for nothing. Intertech's anti-mutagen had been denied to humankind, but not to the Amnion. Vector Shahid, the one free man with the knowledge to replicate Intertech's work, was about to be killed. Morn Highland had endured Angus Thermopylae and Nick Scorzo, rape and now she would be discarded like a piece of scrap. Angus himself, who carried the core of Warden's desperation in his welded resources and secret programming, would become Nick's plaything and tool, the perfect illegal, violent and dehumanized. What was left except shame and the price of failure? Warden Dios was at his best when he asked to see Norna Fasner. He didn't try to explain the request to himself. It was purely intuitive, a small gesture to counterbalance what he'd lost, and he accepted the consequences of acting on it. Yet it seemed to make him stronger with every passing moment. As HS guided him into the secure depths of Holt's headquarters, his heart grew steady and his respiration calmed. Neither his stride nor his composure gave his guards any hint that the dragon had found a way to deprive him of what he loved most. There was always something left. Perhaps that was why he wanted to consult an oracle. So he followed his escort until the two men delivered him to the specialized cave of life support systems and video screens where Norna Fasner lived. At the door, he dismissed them. They had no orders to accompany him in, and surely the dragon could eavesdrop on his mother whenever he wished. Warden entered her sick chamber alone and closed the door. The lights were off in the high, sterile room, but he could see by the phosphorescent glow of the video screens which filled the wall in front of Norna's bed and equipment. That wall was all she had, her whole world. The bed held her rigid, as if it were a traction frame, so that her equipment could do the delicate and obscene work of keeping life in her immured carcass. Only her eyes and mouth could move, and her fingers, allowing her to control the illumination and screens. In the flat, heartless light, she looked spectral and bereaved. The medical advances which sustained her son had come too late to do anything more than impose existence on her. Mortality stained her shriveled skin so that it seemed filthy against the clean linen of her bed. Her equipment gave off so many IR emissions that Warden's prosthetic sight was effectively useless. As far as he could see, she had no aura, perhaps no emotions, possibly no mind. Yet Holt had told him over the years that she remained conscious, not only sentient, but sharp. On one occasion, Holt had said, "I keep her alive, you know. I don't mean my doctors or my orders. I mean me personally. I keep her alive. She would go out like a candle if she didn't hate me too much to die. She lives for the hope that she'll get to see me destroyed. And maybe, just maybe, that she'll be able to see it coming." The dragon had laughed as he said this. Apparently he considered it funny.
Warden was of a different opinion. He kept it to himself, however, now as much as then. He wasn't here to feel sorry for the woman who had taught Holt his hungers. And he had only 10 minutes. If Norna couldn't answer him in that time, the risk of visiting her would be wasted. Nevertheless, he stopped just inside the door, momentarily paralyzed. Holt had told him about the video screens, but he hadn't realized how daunting they could be. 20 or more of them, all alive, all projecting their images simultaneously, all gabbling at once, and all dead, because they had no human IR emissions and therefore contained no life. As inert as Norna herself, newscasts and sex shows vied with comedies, sports programs, and dramas to dominate his attention. Voices conflicted with background music and sound effects up and down the audible spectrum. The effect was at once hypnotic and disturbing, like a white noise rumble which felt soothing, but which presaged some kind of tectonic cataclysm. It created the strange illusion that all but one of the screens offered gibberish as a way of concealing the sole exception, that the exception displayed instead a soothsayer's version of pure, cold truth, and that it changed places constantly with all the others, so that only the most savage and unremitting concentration could hope to glimpse its wisdom as it passed from screen to screen. Warden stifled an impulse to curse the dragon. He didn't have time for that. Steadying himself on urgency, he forced his legs to carry him away from the door toward the screens until he entered Norna's field of view. There he turned, put his back to the video wall, and faced her. "Hello, Norna." In the phosphor gleam, her eyes looked empty, transfixed by death. They made no apparent effort to track individual images. Perhaps she'd learned how to focus on all the programs at the same time. Or perhaps she'd merely forgotten what she was looking for. Her lips and gums chewed constantly, as if she were trying to remember the taste of food. Saliva she couldn't control drooled into the wrinkles across her chin. Just for an instant, however, her gaze flicked toward him. Then it returned to the screens. "Ward." Her voice barely reached him through the ambient mutter. "Warden Dios. It's about time." He cocked an eyebrow in surprise. "You were expecting me," he remarked, because he didn't know what else to say. "Of course I've been expecting you," she muttered like the voices of her world. "Who else can you talk to? Move. You're in my way." Warden glanced behind him, saw that he was indeed obstructing one edge of her view of the wall. Shrugging an apology, he took a step to the side. "Is that better?" "Better?" Something in the twist of her bloodless lips gave the impression that she was laughing. "If you think anything around here ever gets better, you've wasted a visit. We don't have anything to talk about." He frowned. He was in no mood for verbal sparring. Nevertheless, he kept his response casual. "Forgive my choice of words. I certainly haven't seen anything get better." Her toothless gums continued chewing. "No. And you won't. Not until you finish him." Well, Holt had warned him that she was sharp, almost presciently cognizant of the world beyond her screens, the world she couldn't see. Still, her bluntness took him aback. "Finish him." "Isn't that why you're here?" Although she appeared to focus on nothing, follow nothing, her gaze never left the restless movement of images. "Don't you want me to tell you what you need to know to finish him?" A frisson of alarm ran down Warden's back, settled in his lower abdomen. How much could Holt hear? Softly, trusting her to pick his voice out of the gabble, trying to warn her, he asked, "Norna, does he listen in when you have visitors?" He couldn't tell whether she heard him or not. For a moment she was silent. Then her mouth gave another twist that might have been laughter. "How should I know? I never have visitors." He made another attempt. "Should you be careful what you say?" This time she didn't pause or hesitate. "Why? There's nothing left he can do to me. And if you were worried about yourself, he wouldn't be here." Her blank concentration on her screens was eerie, almost ghoulish. Like a woman inured to death and corruption, she watched them as if they showed maggots feasting on corpses. One scene repeated from different angles on all the screens. "Of course," she went on, "he doesn't realize how much I know. He has no idea what I might tell you. That could be dangerous. But I think you're safe enough." Safe? The mere concept startled him. He raised a hand to interrupt her, ask her indulgence. "Norna, forgive me. I guess I'm slow today. I'm not keeping up with you. What makes you think I'm safe here?" Her face in the condoomed that he half expected her to intone like a sibyl. "Everyone who comes here is safe. This is the cave of death where no other harm enters. As long as you remain, you are beyond hurt." Her actual reply was more prosaic, however. "After all the trouble you've caused, he needs you. He can't afford to punish you now." Baffled as much by the way she spoke as by what she said, he countered, "He's Holt Fasner, CEO of the entire created universe. What can he possibly need me for?" Again that twist, like laughter. Apparently she liked his sarcasm. Almost soundlessly her lips shaped her answer. "A scapegoat." Ah, Warden sighed to himself. Someone to blame. That made sense. He felt suddenly that he'd been freed from the confusion of the screens and the mystification of her manner. Now he knew how to talk to her. "Thank you," he said more confidently. "I think I understand. As I'm sure you can guess, I've just come from talking to him. You mentioned all the trouble I've caused, and he told me you warned him I was getting him in trouble. Does he know what kind of trouble it is?" "Shame on you, Ward." Through the interference of other voices, she sounded like a disappointed schoolmarm. "That's not the right question. You know better." Before he could absorb this criticism, she asked, "What did you talk to him about?" He swallowed a rush of impatience. He was running out of time, yet he had nothing to gain by trying to hurry her. Trusting that she didn't need long explanations, he answered, "I told him that Joshua's mission to Thanatos Mine also was a surprise. Joshua has come back into human space with some unexpected survivors." "Such as?" she inquired quickly. He had no business discussing such things with her. On the other hand, why had he bothered to come here if he weren't willing to face the hazards involved? Shrugging to himself, he let her have her way. Nick Scorzo, some of his crew, including a man named Vector Shahid who used to work for Intertech back in the days when Intertech was doing anti-mutagen research. Morn Highland. He did his best to mention Morn as if she had no special significance. And somehow she has a son. A full-grown kid, apparently. She calls him Davies Highland. Norna considered this information for a moment. "What does he want you to do about it?" Warden felt that he was exposing his heart as he replied stiffly, "Deliver Davies to him." Like Norna, he didn't need to refer to the dragon by name. Give Nick control over Joshua. Kill everybody else aboard. Her empty gaze didn't shift. Chewing incessantly, her jaws leaked a small sheen of saliva into the smear on her chin. Only her lips reacted, twisting from side to side. Now he couldn't tell whether she was... He waited until her grimace eased and her cheeks fell slack. Then, in a low whisper, he repeated his question. Norna, does he know? I told him, she answered, invoked by mirth or grief. But he doesn't understand. He fears death too much. It distorts his thinking. Most of us fear death, Warden countered, still whispering. Most of the time we're able to ignore it. She let out a hiss of impatience or vexation. This is no ordinary fear of death. Have you suffered under him so long without figuring that out? If I called it mortal terror, that would be an understatement. He wants to live forever. Bitterly, she nodded to herself. Yes, forever. Haven't I seen it? Why do you think he keeps me damned here? I've spent 50 years paying for what I see. He thinks the amnion are the answer. Genetic magic. He thinks they know how to rescue his body before it fails. Or maybe they can grow him a new one. He can't make peace with them. Humankind wouldn't let him get away with it. Human beings are stupid. She referred to her screens. But nobody is that stupid. But if he lets you go to war, he'll lose everything he wants from the amnion. So he needs this hostile truce. As if she were still on the same subject, she demanded, what makes Davy's Highland so precious? Warden had asked himself that question 6 times already. Now, under the pressure of Norna's insight and his own needs, he forced himself to consider it again. Thinking aloud, he murmured, the amnion used a technique called force growing. I've been hearing for years that they have the means to mature bodies rapidly, and it must work. Otherwise Morn would still be pregnant. She wouldn't have a son yet, never mind a full-grown kid. But how can he have a mind? That was the crucial question, the fatal unknown. How did the amnion compensate for all the years of learning and experience he didn't get? Norna's stare never left her wall of images, yet it forced Warden to go on. They must have some way to create minds artificially. The human organism was inherently functionless without acquired training and information. Or copy them. Copying sounds more plausible. But what did they use for an original? Did they impose one of their own on him? Then he would be an amnione, and Joshua would kill him if Morn didn't. Panic and possibilities ran through him, riding a burst of intuition like high brisance thrust. They must have copied some human mind into his head. He didn't need to finish the thought. Didn't need to say, if they could do that for Davies, they could do it for Holt. Norna was already nodding. Her mummified lips chewed saliva and silence as if that were her oracular secret, the meaning of life. Is that really it? He manipulates the GCES, suppresses the immunity drug, handcuffs my people and me, keeps this undeclared war alive, betrays humanity, just so he can fucking live forever? Dear God, he's got to be stopped. Fine. How? Whose mind did Davies have? Director Dios? Warden had been concentrating on Norna so hard that he hadn't heard the door open or seen the guard stick his head into the room. "Time's up, sir," the man announced carefully. "Your shuttle's waiting." Full of alarm, Warden turned his attention on the guard. Almost immediately, his prosthetic eye gave him one small piece of reassurance. The man's aura spoke of impatience, boredom, weariness, but no unusual anxiety or strain. Therefore, HS wasn't preparing an ambush. Holt hadn't changed his mind about letting Warden return to UMCP HQ. No doubt he was determined not to spare Warden the burden of betraying Angus and Morn. "I'm coming," he told the guard. At the edge of Norna's sight, however, he paused to bow and murmur softly, "I'll do what I can." Her parting words harried him out of the sick chamber like furies, naming his anguish and loss. "That's not good enough, Warden Dios." The guards looked questions at him, involuntarily curious, or perhaps only cautious. Not good enough. He answered them with a shrug and an impersonal frown. Neither of them pursued the matter. He was the UMCP director, and they apparently hadn't been ordered to challenge him. Instead, they simply guided him back to his shuttle, letting him keep his shame to himself. He knew as well as Norna did that merely doing what he could wasn't good enough. He just didn't have any better ideas. Battering his brain for inspiration all the way back to UMCP HQ left him in a foul mood. Holt's orders galled him absolutely. They ate at his sore heart like an injection of vitriol. If he were the kind of man who threw up when he felt nauseous, he would have puked his guts out, trying to rid himself of his despair. Angus and Morn were the children of his best passion, his deepest need. He could sacrifice Vector Shahid and the rest of Nick's people if he had to, could give Trumpet up and let Nick go. He'd done worse. Davies would live, and Warden could at least pray that something would happen to spare the boy from what Holt had in mind. But to give Nick power over Morn and Angus, to hand them over to degradation and death after what they'd already suffered in Warden's name, that was completely and utterly not good enough. Fulminating uselessly as his shuttle approached dock, he told his crew to flare Hashi Lebval, order the DA director to meet him in one of his private offices in 10 minutes. He may have failed to be good enough for Angus and Morn, but he was, by God, going to get the truth out of Hashi. He needed all his tolerance and more to endure the distress inside his own skull. He had none to spare for Hashi's games. The evidence suggested that Hashi was pulling strings behind Warden's back, interposing his own decisions between the UMCP director and events. That could be called malfeasance. It could even be called treason. On the other hand, Hashi apparently wasn't pulling strings for the dragon. His game was his own, for good or ill. Warden had half an hour left until his window opened on the best available listening post. He could wait that long before he coded and sent his orders to Min Donner, before he made his own treachery irrevocable. In that time, he intended to find out how much harm Hashi had done. Naturally, inevitably, the post itself belonged to the UMC. It was part of the vast communications network which Holt Fasner had put in place. In 150 years of hunger and aggrandizement, the dragon had learned to plan ahead. He would be able to obtain copies of Warden's orders to punish her. That thought made Warden want to tear Hashi's head off. His anguish had nowhere else to go. ignoring the salutes of dock security and the urgent requests for his attention. These days, Center considered everything urgent. He strode through the corridors of his domain until he reached the office he'd specified in his message to Hashi Leibval. The DA director was already there, waiting. His face wore a bleary, amiable smile, as if he'd just exchanged some pleasantry with the guards outside the office. In contrast, their expressions were nonplussed, uncomfortable. Their relief as they saluted Warden was plain to his IR sight. Apparently they didn't know how to take Hashi's sense of humor. Director Dios. Hashi's glasses, antique and uncared for, seemed to refract his blue gaze, confusing whatever he saw, or perhaps only whatever he allowed other people to see. Characteristically, his lab coat looked like he'd found it in a waste disposal bin, and then slept in it for weeks. The laces of his old-fashioned shoes trailed at his heels. It was a wonder that he could walk without tripping himself. Inside, Warden snapped brusquely as he thrust the door open. Without waiting for Hashi to precede him, he stalked into the room, rounded the desk, and sat down in his chair. Hashi didn't dally. He entered the office behind Warden, closed the door. As Warden keyed the door seals and security shields, Hashi came forward to stand in front of the desk. Despite his air of assurance and his disreputable professor's appearance, something in the twitching of his long fingers or the smudged glitter of his glasses conveyed the impression that he knew he was in trouble. From the origination of your flare, he began as if he wanted to defuse Warden's anger. I deduce that you have just returned from bearding the dragon in his lair. UMCPHQ scuttlebutt confirms this, and from the darkness of your glance, I deduce that the encounter did not go well. As if he were quoting, he intoned, "The great worm's in his heaven, all's wrong with the world. My condolences." Warden let a snarl bare his teeth. "No jokes, Hashi," he warned. "Spare me your usual line of claptrap. Yes, I've just come from a meeting with my boss. No, it didn't go well. Now I intend to find out why." Hashi permitted himself a bemused air. He asked, "In that case, may I sit?" "No." Behind his lenses, Hashi's eyes widened slightly. "I see. Apparently you consider me the reason your meeting with Holt-Fasner did not go well. May I inquire how that is possible?" "You tell me." Holding Warden's glare, Hashi lifted his shoulders in a small, helpless shrug. "How can I? I have no idea what subject you wish to discuss. Give you a hint." Warden clenched his hands into fists on the desktop. "Tell me about free lunch." Hashi blinked opaquely. Hints of tension sharpened his aura, but he may have been simply baffled. "What is free lunch? Conventional wisdom asserts that no such thing exists." Warden swallowed a curse. Softly, softly, so that he wouldn't rage, he articulated, "Hashi, listen to me. This has gone on long enough. Where did you get that information about events on Billinggate you reported to me a few hours ago?" "As I told you at the time, sir." Apparently the DA director had decided to respond by acting huffy. "It arrived by routine drone service from a listening post in the Commine Station asteroid belt. It was routed to me precisely because it was routine, and as a matter of routine, I have assigned a high priority to any data or transmission which makes reference to Thanatos Minor." The listening post overheard a broadcast from a ship that did not identify herself, therefore presumably an illegal. The more he talked, the more Hashi's pose of indignant virtue began to sound like a disguise for more complex emotions. The broadcast was just that, broadcast, not tight-beamed to the listening post. I have no evidence that this ship knew of the listening post's existence. She was simply trying to warn other vessels, presumably other illegals, of developments on Thanatos Minor, to the extent that she had witnessed them. Some of the details she cited. I mentioned this at the time also, sir. He stressed the word sir. Were not ones which I would have expected to find included in such a broadcast. For that reason, I distrust both the content and the motives of her transmission. However, I delivered the information to you because of its obvious importance. Subtly sarcastic, Hashi concluded, "In what way has my conduct in this matter contributed to the disagreeable outcome of your discussion with our revered CEO?" As if he'd made his point, proved his innocence, he allowed himself to fold down into the nearest chair. Liar! Leaning forward, Warden hammered the desktop with his fists so hard that Hashi jumped out of his seat as if he'd been struck. His glasses slumped to the end of his nose. He stared at Warden over them in plain astonishment. "You've betrayed me, and I won't have it." Warden pronounced each word like an act of violence. "You're finished. I want your resignation here." He thumped the desk again. "In less than an hour." Hashi's mouth hung open. He seemed to have difficulty swallowing. "You," he gaped. "Betrayed you? Personally? What does this have to do with you?" Warden gestured his disgust. "All right, I'll say it differently. You've betrayed your trust. You've betrayed your job." Hashi's reaction was instantaneous. His eyes flashed blue lightning as he retorted, "No, never." His IR emissions said that he was telling the truth, if the word truth had any meaning where he was concerned. "Then, God damn it, tell me about free lunch!" Warden let himself yell. If he didn't, Hashi's bland chicanery was going to drive him mad. Min found her parked right on top of that listening post. She'd used the post to send a message, but Min couldn't crack it because the codes were too goddamn secure. When she was challenged, she told Min she was working for the UMC, for Cletus by God Fane himself. But Holt says that's a lie, and he doesn't lie as well as you do. Abruptly, Warden dropped back in his seat. He took a deep breath, held it while he mastered himself, then let it out in a hard sigh. "So tell me the truth, Hashi, while you still can." Yes. During Warden's outburst, Hashi's eyebrows crawled like insects on his forehead. Slow sweat beaded on his temples. A small flush, incongruously round and precise, appeared in the center of each cheek. Blinking furiously, his blue eyes seemed to send out flares of stark panic and absolute glee, as if for him they came to the same thing. "In that case, Warden," he murmured, "perhaps you'll permit me to amend my earlier report." "Please." "Free lunch," Hashi said quickly. "Captain Darren Scroyle." If Captain Scroyle told the estimable Director of Enforcement Division that he was in the employ of the United Mining Companies, either in the person of Cletus Fane or through some other agency, he was... Hashi made a palpable effort to restrain his instinct for rhetorical camouflage. "Lying to protect his dealings with me." Warden scowled, but in other ways he kept his reactions to himself. "Captain Scroyle is a mercenary," Hashi explained. "I employ such individuals as occasion warrants, and I demand security for my operations. In addition, much of Captain Scroyle's value to me rests on his ability to pass as illegal. For these reasons, he misled Director Donner. On this occasion, I had employed him several weeks ago to visit Thanatos Minor as my surrogate, what you might call a mobile listening post. I am not a complacent man, Warden. I trust the work I have done with Joshua, and I stand by it, but I do not care to rely on it exclusively. Therefore, I employed Captain Scroyle to do exactly what he has done, to provide an early report on the outcome of Joshua's mission.